She woke to the sound of wheels creaking away into silence, dust settling on her skin like a burial shroud, and the weight of a crying infant in her arms she didn't remember holding before. Bitter Springs, Wyoming territory. Late summer 1886. The sun hung merciless in a sky bleached white with heat, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance like water over stone. The stagecoach stop stood alone against the endless stretch of prairie, a weathered structure of splintered wood and peeling paint that offered little more than shade and false promise. A single water trough sat beside the hitching post, its contents reduced to a brown, murky puddle that even the flies seemed to avoid. The last coach had departed an hour ago, leaving behind deep ruts in the dirt, and a woman who couldn't remember her own name. She sat on the edge of the platform, legs dangling over the side, staring at her own hands as though they belonged to a stranger. They were small hands, delicate, with dirt caked beneath the fingernails and what looked like scratches along the knuckles. Had she fought someone? Had she fallen? She couldn't say. The baby in her lap screamed, his face red and twisted with hunger or fear or both, his tiny body arching against her chest with surprising strength. She rocked him instinctively, her body knowing what her mind did not. But the motion brought no comfort to either of them. A man emerged from the station office, wiping sweat from his brow with a stained handkerchief that had long ago lost any usefulness. He was short and round, with suspicious eyes that narrowed when he looked at her, taking in her disheveled appearance with obvious distaste. His shirt was yellowed with old sweat stains, his vest unbuttoned and hanging loose. "Miss," he called over the wailing infant, his voice sharp with impatience. "You got a ticket or not?" She blinked slowly, trying to make sense of the question. Ticket. The word felt foreign on her tongue, like something from another language she'd once spoken but could no longer understand. She opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came. No words, no memory, no explanation. Just the hollow echo of emptiness where her thoughts should have been. The station master stepped closer, his boots heavy on the wooden planks, each footfall like a judgment. Impatience thick in his voice gave way to irritation. "I asked you a question. Where you headed? Who's meeting you here? You can't just sit on my platform all day without purpose." Her throat tightened, muscles constricting as though trying to strangle the words before they could form. She looked down at the baby, his tiny fists beating against her chest with weakening force. Who was he? Why was she holding him? The questions crashed against the walls of her mind like waves against stone, finding no answers, only more darkness, only more void. "I don't know," she whispered finally, the words barely audible over the infant's cries. So soft she wasn't even sure she'd spoken them aloud. The man's expression shifted from annoyance to something colder, something closer to contempt. His lip curled slightly as he took a step back. "You don't know where you're going, or you don't know who you are." "Both," she said, and the admission felt like falling, like stepping off a cliff into nothing. He cursed under his breath. A long string of words she only half heard, and stepped back further, as though her confusion might be contagious, as though whatever had stolen her memory might reach out and take his too. "Well, you can't stay here. This ain't a charity house. This ain't no refuge for lost souls. Stage comes through twice a week and that's it. You got no ticket, no destination, no money, then you got no business on my platform." She tried to stand, but her legs trembled beneath her like those of a newborn colt. The world tilted sideways, spinning like a wagon wheel thrown loose from its axle. She clutched the baby tighter, afraid she might drop him, afraid she might collapse entirely and crush him beneath her. Her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in. "Please," she managed, her voice cracking like dry wood. "I just need a moment to remember. Just a moment to think." "Remembering don't pay for room and board," the station master snapped, his patience clearly exhausted. He jabbed a thick finger toward the horizon, where heat waves made the distant mountains look like they were melting. "Town's 5 miles south. Maybe somebody there knows you. Maybe they don't. Maybe you're running from something. Maybe you're touched in the head. Either way, you can't stay here. We've got rules to follow. Panic clawed at her chest, sharp and desperate. 5 miles in this heat with no water, no memory, and a screaming infant who was already weak with thirst. She had no shoes fit for walking, just thin slippers that were already falling apart at the seams. No hat to shield her from the sun that beat down like hammer blows. Her dress was torn at the hem, stained with something dark she couldn't identify. Blood? Dirt? Something worse? She didn't know, couldn't remember. The baby's cries grew weaker, more desperate, turning into pitiful mewling sounds that cut through her like knives. She looked down at his face, so small and helpless, skin already flushed with heat, and felt a sharp pang of something she couldn't name. Responsibility. Fear. Love. She wasn't sure if she knew what love felt like anymore, or if she ever had. "At least tell me," she said, voice trembling like leaves in wind. "Did anyone leave me here? Did someone say anything? Anything at all?" The station master shook his head, already turning away, clearly done with this conversation. "Lady got off the morning coach with you. Said you'd been sleeping the whole ride, said not to wake you, paid your fare and left. That's all I know. That's all I care to know. What did she look like?" The desperation in her own voice frightened her. He shrugged, one shoulder lifting in complete indifference. "Didn't pay attention. Had a veil on. Heavy black thing. Dark dress. Kept to herself. Didn't say more than 5 words total. Could have been young, could have been old. Don't know, don't care, and just like that, the only thread connecting her to her past snapped clean, leaving her dangling in a void with nothing to hold on to. She sat back down heavily, the platform groaning beneath her weight, wood protesting against wood. The baby had stopped crying, but now he was too quiet, his little chest rising and falling in shallow gasps that made her heart clench. Thirst. He needed water desperately. She needed water. But she had nothing. No canteen, no coin, no help. The sun climbed higher, relentless and unforgiving, a burning eye that watched her suffering with complete indifference. Sweat dripped down her temples, stinging her eyes, mixing with tears she didn't remember shedding. She closed them, willing herself to remember something, anything. A name, a face, a place she'd called home. A mother's voice, a father's laugh, anything. But there was only fog, thick and impenetrable, swallowing every attempt to see through it like quicksand, swallowing a drowning man. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had lost all meaning in this heat, in this emptiness. The station master disappeared inside, the door slamming shut behind him like a final verdict, like the closing of a coffin lid. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone. She thought about standing, about trying to walk those 5 miles to town. But her body wouldn't obey. Her legs felt like they were made of sand, shifting and unstable. The baby in her arms was growing warmer, his skin hot to the touch in a way that terrified her. What if he died? What if this child, whoever he was, died because she couldn't remember how to save him? The guilt was crushing, even though she didn't understand why. Why did she have him? Was he hers? The thought felt wrong somehow, but she couldn't say why. Maybe she was his aunt. Maybe she was a nursemaid. Maybe she'd stolen him. The possibility sent ice through her veins despite the heat. Then she heard it. The soft, rhythmic thud of hooves on hard earth, distant at first, but growing closer. She looked up, squinting against the glare of the sun that had become almost unbearable. A horse approached from the west, moving at an easy pace, its rider a dark silhouette against the blazing sky. As they drew closer, she saw the horse was a paint, white and brown patches gleaming with sweat, muscles moving beneath skin with practiced grace. The rider sat tall and straight, his posture radiating a quiet confidence that needed no announcement, no declaration. He was Comanche. She knew that somehow, though she couldn't say how she knew, couldn't explain the certainty that filled her. His hair was long and black, tied back with a strip of leather that had small beads woven into it. His face was angular and strong, marked by the sun and the wind, the kind of face that had seen much and said little. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple shirt that looked handmade, a knife sheathed at his belt and moccasins that seemed part of the horse itself. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over the station with practiced assessment, then settled on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He stopped his horse a few feet away and dismounted in one fluid motion, landing softly despite his height. For a long moment he simply stood there, studying her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. She felt seen, truly seen, for the first time since waking. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning. "You are hurt?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't think so." But even as she said it, she wasn't certain. Maybe she was hurt in ways she couldn't feel yet. The child. She looked down at the baby, his face pale and damp with sweat, his breathing too shallow. "He needs water. Please, if you have any." Without a word, the man stepped forward with surprising grace and knelt beside her, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something else, something wild and clean. He pulled a leather canteen from his saddle, beautifully crafted with intricate designs tooled into the surface, and uncorked it. He held it out to her, but when her hands shook too badly to take it, he held it steady while she tipped a few drops into the baby's mouth. The child, Isaac, the name came to her suddenly unbidden, as though whispered by a voice she couldn't hear, but knew she could trust, coughed and sputtered, then latched onto the stream of water with desperate hunger, his small throat working to swallow. The Comanche rider watched in silence, his expression unreadable but not unkind. When the baby had drunk his fill and his color began to return slightly, the man lifted the canteen to her own lips without asking, his hand steady. She drank deeply, the water cool and life-giving, tasting of leather and minerals and salvation. "Thank you," she whispered, handing it back with trembling fingers. "Thank you so much." He took it and stood studying her again with those dark, searching eyes. "You have no horse?" "No supplies, no shelter." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway, her voice small. "No." "You wait for someone?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking on the words. "I don't remember." His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with something closer to understanding, to recognition. "You do not remember your name." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes and threatening to spill over. "I don't remember anything. Not where I came from, not who I am, not why I have this baby, not my family or my home or how I got here. I just woke up on the stagecoach and now I'm here and I don't know what to do. I don't know anything." The words spilled out of her in a desperate rush, tumbling over each other, and when they were gone, she felt emptier than before, hollowed out. She waited for him to turn away, to mount his horse and ride off into the vast emptiness of the prairie. That's what anyone with sense would do. Leave the broken woman and the crying baby to whatever fate awaited them. Leave the burden behind, but he didn't leave. Instead, he crouched down again, this time meeting her eyes at level, his gaze steady and somehow comforting. "The white man at the station, he will not help you." "He told me to leave," she said bitterly. "Said I had to walk to town or disappear. He doesn't care which." The rider's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. He glanced toward the station office with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something colder. Then he looked back at her. "You cannot walk to the town. Not in this heat. Not with the child. You would both die before reaching it." "I know," she whispered. The admission like accepting a death sentence. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the baby, then back again. She saw something shift in his expression. A decision being made behind those dark, unreadable eyes. A choice being weighed and accepted. "I am called Nastas," he said finally, his voice formal, as though offering his name was a gift of great value. "I will take you." Her breath caught in her throat. "Where?" "To safety," he said simply, as though it were the most obvious answer in the world. "You need water, food, shelter, rest. I can give you these things." She stared at him, disbelief and hope warring in her chest, creating a painful knot beneath her ribs. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. I could be anyone. I could be dangerous." For the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, softening the hard lines of his face. You do not know yourself, but that does not mean you are not worth knowing. It does not mean you deserve to die in the dust. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and unbidden, carving clean paths through the dirt on her face. She didn't know why she was crying, only that the kindness in his words had cracked something open inside her that she hadn't known was sealed shut, hadn't known was holding back a flood. Nasta stood and extended his hand, palm up, fingers slightly curved. Come. She looked at his hand, calloused and strong, marked with old scars that told stories of survival. And then at the baby in her arms, Isaac. She didn't know if that was truly his name, didn't know if she had any right to name him, but it felt right. It felt like something she could hold on to in the swirling chaos of her lost memory. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, and he pulled her to her feet with ease, as though she weighed nothing at all. She swayed slightly, lightheaded from the heat and exhaustion and dehydration, but he steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch respectful but sure. "Can you ride?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "I think so," she said, though she wasn't certain of anything anymore. Maybe she'd never ridden a horse in her life. Maybe she'd ridden thousands of miles. She had no way of knowing. He led her to his horse, a beautiful paint with intelligent eyes that watched them approach with calm curiosity. The animal's coat was well groomed, its mane braided with small ornaments. Nastas lifted the baby from her arms with surprising tenderness, cradling Isaac against his chest as though he'd done it 100 times before, as though holding infants was as natural to him as breathing. Then he helped her onto the horse's back, his hands respectful, giving her dignity even in her helplessness. Once she was seated, he handed Isaac back to her carefully, making sure she had a secure hold before releasing the child. Then he mounted behind her in one smooth motion. His movements economical and practiced, she felt the warmth of his body at her back, solid and reassuring, like a wall between her and all the dangers of the world. His arms came around her to take the reins, not trapping her, but surrounding her with a strange sense of safety she hadn't felt since waking. Maybe hadn't felt ever. "Hold him close," Nastas said quietly, his breath warm near her ear. "The ride will be long, but I will not let you fall." She nodded, pressing Isaac against her chest, feeling his heartbeat against hers, fast and fluttering like a bird. The baby had fallen asleep, exhausted from crying, his tiny breaths warm against her collarbone, his small weight both burden and blessing. As the horse began to move, she glanced back at the stagecoach stop one last time. The station master stood in the doorway, watching them leave with a scowl, his arms crossed over his chest. She didn't care. That place held nothing for her. No answers, no mercy, no hope. Just dust and indifference and the slow death of abandonment. But this man, this stranger, who called himself Nastas, had offered her something she desperately needed. Not answers, because he couldn't give those. Not explanations, because he didn't have them. Just presence, just kindness. Just the simple human decency of not leaving someone to die when you had the power to save them. They rode in silence across the open prairie, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, golden and wild and beautiful, in a way that made her chest ache with emotions she couldn't name. Rolling hills covered in tall grass that swayed like ocean waves, clusters of juniper and sage that perfumed the air, distant mountains that looked like sleeping giants. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know what would happen when they arrived. But for the first time since waking in that stagecoach with no memory and a baby in her arms, she felt something other than fear. She felt found. The Comanche camp appeared as the sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays painting the circle of lodges in shades of amber and deep crimson. Hazel had never seen anything like it. The structures rose from the earth like natural formations, their buffalo hide coverings decorated with symbols and patterns that seemed to tell stories in a language she couldn't read. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires, and the scent of roasting meat made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. Nastas guided the paint horse through the outer edge of the camp with quiet confidence. People emerged from their lodges, their faces curious but not hostile. Children stopped their games to stare. Women paused in their work, hands stilling over grinding stones and stretched hides. Men stood from where they'd been sharpening weapons or repairing tools, their eyes following the stranger being brought into their midst. Hazel felt every gaze like a physical touch. She clutched Isaac tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. These people had every reason to distrust her, to reject her. She was white, a representative of the people who had taken their lands, killed their buffalo, broken every treaty. And yet Nastas had brought her here, into the heart of his home, offering protection to someone who belonged to the world that had hurt his people. He dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, muscles cramping from the long ride and exhaustion. Nastas steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch brief but grounding. An older woman approached, her face weathered and wise, silver threading through her long black hair. She wore a dress decorated with intricate beadwork, and her eyes, sharp and assessing, moved from Nastas to Hazel to the baby with practiced efficiency. Nastas spoke to her in Comanche, his voice respectful, deferential. The language was beautiful, flowing and rhythmic, nothing like the harsh English she'd heard at the station. The woman listened, her expression unchanging, then asked several questions. Nastas answered each one, gesturing occasionally toward Hazel and Isaac. Finally, the older woman nodded and spoke a single word that seemed to carry weight. "This is Nadua," Nastas said, switching to English for Hazel's benefit. "She is the grandmother of my wife who is passed. She will help you and the child." Hazel's throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Nadua. "Thank you so much." Nadua studied her for a long moment, then reached out and gently touched Isaac's head. The baby stirred but didn't wake. The old woman said something in Comanche, her tone softer now, almost gentle. Nastas translated, "She says the child is strong. He will live. But you must rest and eat, or you will not be strong enough to care for him." Hazel nodded, tears threatening again. She was so tired of crying, tired of being weak, but the kindness kept undoing her. Nadua gestured for her to follow, and led her toward a lodge, set slightly apart from the others. The entrance flap was pulled back, revealing a clean interior with sleeping robes arranged along the walls, a small fire pit in the center, and various belongings stored in neat bundles. Inside, the air was cooler, the buffalo hide thick enough to keep out the worst of the day's heat. Nadua pointed to a pile of soft furs and spoke again. Nastas, who had followed them inside, translated, "You will sleep here. She will bring food and water. Tomorrow, when you are stronger, she will ask you questions." Hazel sank onto the furs gratefully, her body screaming with relief. Isaac began to fuss, his face scrunching up in preparation for another crying fit. Nadua made a soft clicking sound with her tongue and produced a small leather pouch from her dress. She opened it and showed Hazel the contents, dried berries and some kind of ground meal. "For the child," Nastas explained. "Mixed with water, it will give him strength until you can feed him properly." Hazel watched as Nadua prepared a thin paste, mixing the powder with water from a clay vessel until it formed a smooth consistency. The old woman dipped her finger in it and touched it to Isaac's lips. He made a face, then opened his mouth eagerly, sucking the mixture from her finger. Nadua smiled, the first expression of warmth Hazel had seen from her, and prepared more, while Nadua fed Isaac. Nastas stood near the entrance, his posture relaxed but alert, as though he were ready to defend them if necessary. Hazel found herself studying him in the flickering firelight. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, though the hardness in his eyes suggested he'd lived more than his years. The scar on his left cheekbone, faint but visible, curved down toward his jaw. A story there, she thought. "Pain there? Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, the question bursting out before she could stop it. "You don't know me. I could bring trouble to your people." Nastas was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. 3 winters ago, I was shot by a rancher who thought I was stealing his cattle. I was not. I was tracking a wolf that had killed one of our horses. But he did not ask. He did not care. He shot me and left me to die in the snow. Hazel's breath caught. She saw Najua's hands still over Isaac, the old woman listening even though she gave no sign of it. A white woman found me, Nastas continued. A settler's wife. She could have left me. Her husband would have wanted her to, but she pulled me onto her wagon and took me to her barn. She cleaned my wounds, gave me water and food, hid me from her husband for 3 days until I was strong enough to ride. She never asked my name, never asked for anything in return. When I left, she simply said, "Go safely, that is all." He paused, his jaw tightening with emotion he kept carefully controlled. She died the next spring. Fever took her. I heard about it from a trader. I never got to thank her, never got to repay the debt. So when I saw you at that station, I saw her. I saw someone who needed help and did not deserve to die alone. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Hazel felt tears sliding down her cheeks again, but this time she didn't try to stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry she's gone. And I'm sorry for whatever my people have done to yours." Nasta shook his head slightly. "You are not responsible for the actions of others. You are only responsible for yourself." That is what she taught me. Najua finished feeding Isaac and laid him gently on the furs beside Hazel. The baby was already asleep, his belly full, his breathing deep and even. The old woman then brought Hazel a bowl of stew, rich with meat and root vegetables, and a cup of cool water. Hazel ate slowly, each bite an act of gratitude, each swallow a small resurrection. When she finished, Najwa took the bowl and spoke to Nastas again. He nodded and turned to Hazel. "She says you should sleep now. You are safe here. No one will harm you or the child. Tomorrow we will talk more." Hazel wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Where was she? How far had they traveled? What would happen to her and Isaac? But exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight, dragging her down into darkness. "Thank you," she managed, looking at both of them. "Thank you both." Nastas inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement, then left the lodge with Najwa following. The flap fell closed behind them, and Hazel was alone with Isaac in the quiet darkness. She pulled the baby close, feeling his warmth against her, and closed her eyes. Sleep came swiftly, but it was not peaceful. Dreams plagued her, fractured images that made no sense. A woman's face twisted with anger, the sound of breaking glass. A man's voice, cold and commanding, saying words she couldn't quite hear. Running through darkness with Isaac in her arms, branches tearing at her dress, fear choking her. Then nothing. Blackness, the sensation of falling. She woke with a gasp, her heart racing, sweat cooling on her skin. Dawnlight filtered through the lodge's smoke hole, painting everything in soft grey. Isaac slept on beside her, undisturbed by her nightmares. She sat up slowly, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache, and tried to calm her breathing. The dream had felt real. More than real, like a memory, trying to surface through murky water. But every time she reached for it, tried to grasp the details, they slipped away like smoke. Frustration burned in her chest. Who was she? Why couldn't she remember? The large flap opened, and Najwa entered carrying a bundle of clothes. She set them down near Hazel and gestured at her torn, stained dress with obvious disapproval. Then she mimed removing the dress and putting on the new clothes, her meaning clear even without words. Hazel looked at the bundle. It was a simple dress made of soft deerskin, decorated with minimal beadwork, practical and beautiful. She touched it hesitantly. "For me?" Nadua nodded, then pointed at Hazel's dress again and made a sound of disgust. Despite everything, Hazel found herself smiling. The old woman had a point. Her dress was ruined, barely holding together, and probably crawling with who knew what after days of travel. With Nadua's help, she changed into the deerskin dress. It fit surprisingly well, comfortable and cool against her skin. Nadua then produced a comb made of bone and began working through Hazel's tangled hair with surprising gentleness. The rhythmic pulling and smoothing was almost meditative, and Hazel found herself relaxing for the first time in days. When her hair was finally combed out, Nadua braided it simply and tied the end with a strip of leather. Then she stepped back and examined her work with a critical eye before nodding in satisfaction. She said something in Comanche that sounded almost approving. "She says you look less like a ghost now," came Nastas's voice from outside the lodge. "May I enter?" Yes," Hazel called, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. He ducked through the entrance, and his eyes widened almost imperceptibly when he saw her. Something flickered across his face too quickly for her to read, then was gone. "You look better," he said simply. "Stronger. I feel better," she admitted. "Thank you for the clothes. They were my wife's," he said quietly. "Nadua thought you should have them. She would have wanted that." The weight of that gift settled over Hazel like a blanket. To be given clothes that had belonged to a dead woman, clothes that must hold memories and grief. It was an act of profound generosity. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Kimimela. It means butterfly." His voice was steady, but pain flickered in his eyes. "She died giving birth to our son. They both died. 2 winters passed." "I'm so sorry," Hazel whispered, understanding now why he'd helped her, why he'd been so gentle with Isaac. Every time he looked at the baby, he must see the child he'd lost. Nastas was quiet for a moment, then seemed to shake off the memory. "Nadua has questions for you. She needs to know if you remember anything. Anything at all that might help us understand who you are and why you were left at that station." Hazel's stomach clenched with anxiety. "I've been trying to remember. I had dreams last night, but they don't make sense. Just fragments. Tell us the fragments," he said. "Sometimes the small pieces make a larger picture." She closed her eyes, trying to recall the nightmare's details. A woman's face. She was angry, screaming at me. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt her rage. And there was a man. His voice was cold, authoritative. He was giving orders. Then I was running through darkness with Isaac, branches scratching me, and I was terrified. Not for myself, but for him. I was afraid someone would take him from me. Nastas translated for Nadua, who listened intently, her weathered face thoughtful. When he finished, the old woman asked several questions, which Nastas relayed. "Do you remember the woman's face clearly? Could you describe her?" Hazel concentrated, but the image was already fading like morning mist. "No, just anger. Just the feeling of being hated." The man's voice, was it familiar? Like someone you knew well? She shook her head. "I don't think so. It felt distant, like he was far away or speaking to someone else. And the child, when you think of him, does he feel like yours? Like your son?" That question struck something deep. Hazel looked at Isaac, still sleeping peacefully, and tried to examine her feelings honestly. "No," she said slowly. "He doesn't feel like mine, but he feels like my responsibility, like I'm supposed to protect him, no matter what." Nadua nodded when this was translated, as though it confirmed something she'd suspected. She spoke at length, her words flowing like water, and Nastas listened carefully before translating. "She says you have the look of someone who has been through great shock. Not just the loss of memory, but something deeper. A trauma that has closed parts of your mind to protect you from pain too great to bear. She has seen it before in warriors who survive terrible battles. The mind hides what the heart cannot hold. Can it come back?" Hazel asked desperately. "Will I remember?" "Sometimes yes, sometimes no," Nastas said. "Nadua says it is like a wounded animal. You cannot force it out of hiding. You can only create safety and wait." Hazel felt tears burning behind her eyes again, but blinked them back. She was tired of crying, tired of being helpless. "What do I do until then? I can't stay here forever. Your people have their own struggles. I don't want to be a burden." Nastas exchanged a look with Nadua, something passing between them that needed no words. Then he turned back to Hazel. "You will stay until you remember, or until you are strong enough to choose your own path. In return, you will help where you can. Nadua will teach you our ways. You will work alongside the other women. You will earn your place here." The idea of having a place, even temporarily, made something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "I can do that. I'll work hard, I promise." "There is one more thing," Nastas said, his expression serious. "You need a name. The others will not know what to call you. A name." She'd been avoiding thinking about it, afraid that choosing a name would somehow seal away her real identity forever. But Nastas was right. She couldn't go on being nameless. "I don't know what to choose," she admitted. Nadua spoke then, pointing at something near the lodge entrance. Hazel followed her gesture and saw a small cluster of wildflowers growing just outside, their petals a soft purple in the morning light. Nadua said a word in Comanche, then Nastas translated, "Hazel, the flowers that grow in harsh places that bloom even when others cannot. She thinks it suits you." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hazel looked at the flowers, their delicate beauty persisting despite the difficult terrain. Something about the name felt right, felt true, in a way she couldn't explain. "Hazel," she repeated softly, testing it on her tongue. "Yes, I'll be Hazel." Nastas nodded, and something that might have been approval crossed his face. "Then welcome, Hazel. May you find what you seek among us." As the sun climbed higher and the camp around them came fully to life with the sounds of daily work and children's laughter, Hazel felt something shift inside her. She was still lost, still broken, still afraid. But she had a name now. She had shelter. She had people who, for reasons she didn't fully understand, had chosen not to abandon her. It was more than she'd had yesterday. And perhaps, for now, it was enough. The days blurred together in a rhythm Hazel had never known, but somehow understood. She woke before dawn, to the sound of the camp stirring, to the soft voices of women preparing for the day's work, and the distant whinny of horses being led to pasture. Isaac would wake shortly after, hungry and demanding, and she would feed him the mixture Nadua had taught her to prepare from groundnuts and dried berries mixed with water from the stream. Nadua proved to be a patient but exacting teacher. She showed Hazel how to scrape hides properly, the motion requiring strength and precision she didn't know she possessed. The first time she tried, her strokes were too shallow, leaving patches of membrane that would rot if not removed. Nadua had taken the scraper from her hands without a word, demonstrated the proper angle and pressure, then handed it back and waited. Hazel tried again, muscles burning, and this time the hide came clean. The other women watched her with cautious curiosity. They didn't speak to her directly at first, but they didn't turn her away either. When she struggled with a particularly tough section of hide, anonymous hands would appear to help hold it steady. When Isaac cried during her work, someone would always lift him, rock him, soothe him until Hazel could take a break. These small kindnesses came without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude, just quiet acknowledgement that she was trying. One morning, a young woman named Talasi approached while Hazel was grinding dried corn into meal. Talasi couldn't have been more than 16, with bright eyes and a quick smile. She sat down beside Hazel and began grinding her own batch, matching Hazel's rhythm. They worked in silence for a while, then Talasi spoke in halting English. "You learn fast," she said, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "Nadua says you have strong spirit." Hazel looked up surprised. It was the first time anyone besides Nastas had spoken to her directly in English. "Thank you. Everyone has been very kind." Talasi tilted her head, studying her with open curiosity. "You remember nothing? Nothing of before?" "No," Hazel admitted, the familiar frustration rising. "It's like trying to see through thick fog. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of something, but then it's gone." "Maybe is better," Talasi said thoughtfully. "Maybe what you forget is worse than not knowing." The words settled over Hazel like a cold wind. She'd considered this possibility in the dark hours before dawn when Isaac slept, and her mind wandered. What if her past was something terrible? What if she'd done something unforgivable? The not knowing was torture, but perhaps the knowing would be worse. The baby, Talasi continued, glancing at Isaac where he lay sleeping in a cradleboard Nadua had made. He is not yours, yes? You do not have the look of a mother. Hazel's hands stilled on the grinding stone. What do you mean? Talasi gestured vaguely at her own body. Women who birth children, they change. Body changes. You do not have these changes. And the way you hold him, it is careful, like you fear breaking him. A mother knows her child's weight, knows how to hold without thinking. The observation was astute and undeniable. Hazel had noticed the same thing herself, but hadn't wanted to examine it too closely. I think you're right, she said quietly. I think I was protecting him from something, or someone. Then you are brave, Talasi said simply. To protect a child not yours, to run with no memory of why. That is brave. Before Hazel could respond, a commotion erupted near the edge of camp. Voices rose in alarm, and several men ran toward the horse corral. Talasi jumped to her feet, her face suddenly tense. Stay here, she commanded, then ran toward the disturbance. Hazel gathered Isaac from his cradleboard and held him close, her heart pounding. Through the lodges, she could see a group of riders approaching. They were white men, perhaps 6 of them, dressed in dusty trail clothes and carrying rifles across their saddles. The lead rider was a tall man with a thick beard and eyes that swept the camp with barely concealed contempt. Nastas emerged from his lodge, moving with deliberate calm to meet them. Several other Comanche men flanked him, their postures alert but not aggressive. The lead rider spoke, his voice carrying across the camp. We're looking for a woman. White woman, early 20s, traveling with an infant. She was last seen at the Bitter Spring station 3 days ago. You seen anyone matching that description? Hazel's blood turned to ice. They were looking for her. But who were they? Why did the thought of them finding her fill her with such visceral terror? Nastas's expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. Many travelers pass through this territory. We do not keep track of white people's movements. Don't play games with me, Comanche, the man growled. This woman is wanted for kidnapping. She took a child that doesn't belong to her and ran. We got legal authority to search for her, and if you're harboring her, you're breaking territorial law. Kidnapping. The word hit Hazel like a physical blow. Had she stolen Isaac? Was she a criminal? The fragments of her dreams suddenly took on sinister meaning. The angry woman, the commanding voice, the desperate flight through darkness. Had she taken him from his rightful family? And we harbor no criminals, Nastas said, his voice steady. You are welcome to look, but you will do so with respect. This is our land and you are guests here. The bearded man's jaw tightened with anger, but he nodded curtly. Fine, we'll look. But if we find her and you've been lying, there'll be consequences. Hazel watched as the men dismounted and began moving through the camp, peering into lodges, questioning anyone who crossed their path. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped Isaac. Nadua appeared suddenly at her side, materializing like a spirit. The old woman took one look at Hazel's face and understood immediately. Without a word, Nadua took Isaac from her arms and gestured urgently toward the back of the lodge. She pushed aside a pile of hides, revealing a shallow depression in the ground, barely large enough for a person to crouch in. It was a hiding place, probably used for storing food or valuables. Nadua pointed at it, then at Hazel, her meaning unmistakable. I can't, Hazel whispered, terror warring with guilt. If I hide, I'm admitting I did something wrong. Maybe I should face them, find out the truth. Nadua grabbed her shoulders with surprising strength and spoke rapidly in Comanche, her tone urgent and fierce. Then she switched to broken English. You hide. You remember nothing. Cannot defend self. They take you, you hang. Hide now. Remember first. Then truth. The logic was undeniable. How could she defend herself against accusations when she couldn't remember what she'd done? If she'd truly kidnapped Isaac, she deserved punishment. But what if the truth was more complicated? What if there were reasons, justifications she couldn't access? Footsteps approached the lodge. Men's voices, rough and impatient. Nadua shoved Hazel toward the hiding place with surprising force. Hazel dropped into the depression, curling herself as small as possible, and Nadua quickly covered her with hides and bundles, working with practiced efficiency. Through the layers of leather and fur, Hazel could barely breathe, but she forced herself to remain absolutely still. The lodge flap opened. "Anyone in here?" A voice called out. "Only old woman and baby," Nadua responded in English, far more fluent than she'd used with Hazel. The deception was deliberate, Hazel realized. Nadua had been testing her, seeing if she could be trusted before revealing her true capabilities. "Where'd you get the white baby?" Another voice demanded. "Trade," Nadua said calmly. "From Shoshone woman. Her milk dried up, baby dying. We take, we feed. He live now? Let me see him." Through her suffocating hiding place, Hazel heard Isaac begin to fuss. Her every instinct screamed to go to him, to protect him, but she forced herself to remain frozen. Nadua spoke softly to the baby in Comanche, and his cries settled into whimpers. "Could be him," one man said. "Hard to tell with babies." "Boss said the woman would be with him," another argued. "No woman here except the old squaw. Check outside, see if there's any sign of a white dress, white woman's belongings." Hazel's heart hammered so hard she was certain they could hear it. Her discarded dress, stained and torn, was bundled somewhere in this very lodge. If they found it, Nadua would be implicated in hiding her. These people who had shown her nothing but kindness would suffer for protecting her. The men moved around the lodge, and she heard things being shifted, examined, dropped carelessly. Each sound made her flinch, expecting at any moment to feel the hides ripped away, to be dragged into daylight and judgment. Minutes stretched into eternity. "Nothing here," one man finally said. "Just Indian stuff. Check the next lodge." The footsteps retreated. The flap fell closed. But Hazel remained frozen, not daring to move until Nadua's voice came soft and low. "They go now, but you stay hidden. Not safe yet." Hazel stayed in that suffocating darkness for what felt like hours. Her legs cramped, her lungs burned for fresh air, and terror wrapped around her throat like a noose. What had she done? If she'd truly kidnapped Isaac, didn't these men have every right to take her? But why couldn't she remember? And why did every fiber of her being scream that going with them would be a death sentence? Finally, the hides were pulled back, and Nastas's face appeared above her. "They are gone," he said quietly. "You can come out." She emerged shakily, her limbs stiff and aching, gasping for air. Nastas helped her stand, his hands steady on her arms. Isaac was crying again, and she reached for him desperately, needing to feel his warmth, to confirm he was still safe. "They said I kidnapped him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They said I'm a criminal." "What they said and what is true may not be the same thing," Nastas replied. "Men lie, especially to Indians, especially when they want something. But what if it's true?" Her voice broke. "What if I stole him from his real family? What if I'm a terrible person and I just can't remember?" Nastas studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "I have known terrible people," he said finally. "I have seen evil in men's hearts. You do not have that darkness. Whatever you did, whatever brought you to that station with this child, I do not believe it was evil." "How can you be sure?" she demanded, desperate for certainty in a world that had become nothing but questions. "Because evil does not care for children the way you care for him," Nastas said simply. "Evil does not hold them gently, does not wake in the night to soothe them, does not put their needs above its own. You may not remember who you are, but your actions show your heart." His words eased something in her chest, but doubt remained like a splinter under skin. "What do I do now?" "They'll come back. They'll search more thoroughly next time." "Then we must give you time to remember," Nastas said. "And we must be ready to defend you if your memory returns and shows you are innocent." Nadua spoke then, her voice firm despite her age. Nastas translated. "She says the men who came today, they were not law. Real lawmen have papers, have badges. These men had nothing but guns and lies. She thinks they want the child for reasons that have nothing to do with justice." The observation sent ice down Hazel's spine. "Then who are they? What do they want with Isaac?" "That," Nastas said grimly, "is what we must discover." That night, Hazel couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the lodge made her start, certain the men had returned. She held Isaac close, feeling his small heartbeat against her chest, and tried desperately to remember something, anything that would explain this nightmare. Around midnight, when the camp had fallen into deep silence, a memory surfaced like a drowning person breaking through water. It came with such force that she gasped aloud. A grand house, polished floors and heavy curtains. A woman in an expensive dress, her face twisted with rage, screaming, "You will not take him from me. He is my grandson." "My blood?" And Hazel's own voice, younger somehow, desperate and pleading. "He's not safe here. You know what he's capable of. Please just let me take him somewhere safe." "Oh, you're nothing but a governess." The woman shrieked. "A servant. You have no rights to him. If you take him, I will see you hanged for kidnapping." Then running. Down grand stairs, through a kitchen, out into darkness with Isaac screaming in her arms. Behind her, men shouting, chasing. The sound of gunfire. Hazel sat up, shaking violently, tears streaming down her face. A governess. She'd been Isaac's governess. And she'd taken him from his grandmother's house because someone there had been dangerous. But who, and why couldn't she remember more? Nastas appeared at the lodge entrance, as though he'd sensed her distress. "You remembered something," he said. "It wasn't a question. I was his governess," she whispered. "I took him from his grandmother's house. She called it kidnapping, but I was trying to protect him. Someone there was dangerous. Someone was going to hurt him." "Who?" Nastas asked, kneeling beside her. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I can't remember his face. I just remember fear. Terrible, overwhelming fear that if I didn't run, Isaac would die." Nastas was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "A grandmother rich enough to send men after you. A threat so great you fled with nothing. This is more than a simple family dispute." "What do I do?" Hazel asked, looking at him with desperate hope. "How do I prove I was right to run?" "First, you remember everything," he said firmly. "Your mind is protecting you, but you must push past that protection. You must face what you fear. And if what I remember proves I was wrong," she whispered. Nastas met her eyes steadily. "Then we will deal with that truth when it comes." But running from truth never made anyone free. He was right, she knew. But as she held Isaac close and felt the weight of unknown guilt pressing down on her, she wondered if freedom was even possible anymore. Or if the moment she'd fled that grand house with a baby in her arms, she'd traded her future for his life. And whether, when all was remembered and revealed, the trade would prove worthwhile. The memories came in fragments over the following days, each one sharp and cutting like broken glass. Hazel would be grinding corn or mending a tear in a hide, when suddenly her hands would still and her vision would blur, replaced by scenes from a life she'd forgotten. She remembered a name now. Her own name! Clara Whitmore, the daughter of a schoolteacher who died of consumption when she was 16, leaving her alone in Boston with nothing but an education and desperation. She'd taken the governess position with the Hartwell family because she had no other choice. Because sleeping in a servant's quarters in Philadelphia was better than starving on the streets of Boston. The Hartwell house had been magnificent. 3 stories of brick and marble, with gardens that stretched half an acre and stables that housed 6 horses. Marcus Hartwell had made his fortune in railroads and banking, and his wife, Constance, had come from old money, the kind that stretched back to before the Revolution. They'd had 1 child, a son named Thomas, and Thomas had married a woman named Victoria against his parents' wishes. Victoria. The memory of her face made Hazel's stomach twist with nausea. Beautiful in the way a snake is beautiful, all smooth skin and cold eyes. She'd been an actress before Thomas met her, or so the household staff whispered, though no one could say which theatre or which productions. Thomas had been infatuated, blind to everything except her beauty and the way she laughed at his jokes. They'd married quickly, too quickly, and Isaac had been born 8 months later. Thomas had been overjoyed, parading the baby through the house, making plans for his son's future. But Victoria had been different, cold, distant. She'd refused to nurse the baby, refused to hold him for more than a few minutes at a time. The wet nurse had done most of the caring until she'd been dismissed suddenly, and Hazel had been reassigned from tutoring the neighbors' children to caring for Isaac full-time. That's when she'd started noticing things. The way Victoria would look at Isaac, with something that wasn't quite hatred, but wasn't love either. The way she'd pinch him when she thought no one was watching, hard enough to leave marks. The laudanum she kept in her room, the bottles multiplying faster than any medicine should. The men who came to visit when Thomas was away on business, men who didn't look like the sort who belonged in a house like the Hartwells. Then Thomas had died. Thrown from his horse during a morning ride, his neck broken instantly. The funeral had been grand, the grief performative, and Victoria had worn black silk that probably cost more than Hazel earned in a year. But 2 days after the burial, Hazel had overheard a conversation that changed everything. She'd been in the nursery with Isaac when voices had risen from the parlor below. The ventilation grate carried sound perfectly if you knew where to stand. Victoria's voice sharp and demanding. "I don't care what you promised him. The child is mine now, and I'll do with him as I please." And Constance Hartwell's voice cold as winter stone. "Victoria, be reasonable. Isaac is my grandson, my only connection to Thomas. You cannot simply send him away." "Can't I?" Victoria had laughed, a sound without humor. "I never wanted the brat. He was insurance, nothing more. Thomas doted on him, left everything to him in that ridiculous will. But now Thomas is gone, and I have no intention of spending the next 15 years raising another woman's mistake." The words had stunned Hazel into immobility. Another woman's mistake. Isaac wasn't Victoria's child. He couldn't be. "But then whose—" "You will not touch that child," Constance had hissed. "I will not allow you to abandon him, or worse, you'll allow whatever I decide," Victoria had said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "Unless you want certain letters to become public. Letters that detail exactly how your precious son really died. How it wasn't an accident at all, but a very convenient fall, arranged by someone who stood to inherit everything if he was gone." The silence that followed had been suffocating. Then Constance's voice, broken and desperate. "You killed my son. I freed myself from a prison," Victoria had corrected. "And now I'm freeing myself from his whelp. There's an orphanage in Chicago that asks no questions if the price is right. Or perhaps I'll simply leave him somewhere. A train station, a church. It hardly matters." Hazel had stood frozen by that grate, Isaac sleeping peacefully in her arms, and understood with perfect clarity that this child would die if she didn't act. Victoria was capable of murder. She'd killed Thomas, and she'd have no compunction about disposing of an inconvenient infant, regardless of what she'd promised Constance. That night, Hazel had packed a small bag. She'd taken the $30 she'd saved from her wages, stolen another $20 from the household accounts, and wrapped Isaac in the warmest blanket she could find. She'd left a note for Constance, brief and desperate, explaining what she'd heard and begging forgiveness. Then she'd slipped out the servants' entrance at 3 a.m. and hadn't looked back. The memory of those first terrifying days on the run crashed over her now as she sat in Nadua's lodge, making her gasp aloud. Isaac looked up from where he was playing with a carved wooden horse, his eyes curious. She pulled him close, pressing her face to his soft hair, and wept. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember everything." Nastas had been sitting near the entrance, working on repairing a bridle, and he set it aside immediately. "Tell me," he said simply, so she did. Every detail, every horrible revelation, every desperate decision that had led her from Philadelphia to that Stagecoach station in Wyoming. She told him about Victoria's confession, about Thomas's murder, about the threat to Isaac's life. She told him about the days of travel, constantly looking over her shoulder, spending money on tickets and food until she had almost nothing left. She told him about the woman on the stagecoach, veiled and silent, who she'd thought was just another passenger until she'd woken to find herself alone at Bitter Springs with no memory and no explanation. "The woman drugged you," Nastas said when she finished. "It wasn't a question. Someone hired her to take you far from Philadelphia and leave you somewhere you could not easily return from." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "Victoria," Hazel said bitterly. "She must have discovered I'd taken Isaac, sent someone after us. But why not just kill us? Why go through the trouble of drugging me and stealing my memories? Because a dead governess and a dead baby would raise questions," Nastas reasoned. "But a woman who simply disappeared with a child she'd kidnapped? A woman who abandoned him in the wilderness? That is a different story. That makes Victoria the victim, not the villain. The logic was sound and chilling. Then the men who came looking, they were her men. Hired to find Isaac and take him back. Or to finish what she started," Nastas added grimly. "If you are found, you cannot tell your story. Dead women do not testify." Fear coiled in Hazel's stomach like a living thing. "What do? I can't go back to Philadelphia. They'll hang me for kidnapping. And even if I tried to tell the truth about Thomas's murder, who would believe a governess over a wealthy widow? Victoria would destroy me." "Then you do not go back," Nastas said firmly. "You stay here where you are safe. You raise Isaac as your own. You build a new life." "But he's not mine," Hazel protested, even as her heart ached at the thought of losing him. "He has a grandmother who loves him. Constance Hartwell. She was cold, but she cared about him. She wanted to protect him from Victoria." "And where was this grandmother when you fled?" Nastas asked, his tone sharp. "Why did you not go to her for help?" Hazel opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Why hadn't she? The question had haunted her during those first desperate days of flight, but she'd been too terrified to examine it closely. Now, with her memories returned, she forced herself to face the truth. Because Constance would have chosen her reputation over Isaac's safety, she said slowly. Victoria had evidence of Thomas's murder, letters that would expose Constance's family to scandal. Constance might have loved Isaac, but she loved her social standing more. She would have made a deal with Victoria, convinced herself that sending Isaac to an orphanage was for the best, that he'd be cared for there. She would have sacrificed him to protect herself. "Then Isaac has no family worth returning to," Nastas said. "Only you. You are the one who risked everything to save him. You are the one who loves him enough to lose yourself for his safety." The words settled over Hazel like a benediction and a burden. She looked at Isaac, now contentedly chewing on the wooden horse's ear, oblivious to the adult conversations that determined his fate. He smiled at her, that wide, toothless grin that never failed to melt her heart, and reached his chubby arms toward her. "I can't be his mother," she whispered, gathering him close. "I don't know how. None of us know how until we do it," Nadua said from the corner where she'd been listening silently. Her English was flawless now. The pretense of limited understanding completely dropped. "I did not know how to be a mother when my first child came. I was terrified I would break him, that I would fail him. But love teaches what knowledge cannot. You already love this child. The rest will come." Hazel looked at the old woman, seeing her clearly for the first time. "You've been testing me. This whole time, you've been watching to see if I was worthy of staying." "Of course," Nadua said without apology. "We have been hurt too many times by white people who take and give nothing back. I had to know if you were different, if your heart was true." "And?" Hazel asked, barely breathing. "And I see a woman who would die for a child not her own," Nadua said. "I see a woman who works without complaint, who learns without arrogance, who gives respect even when she is afraid. You are welcome in this camp, Hazel, or should I call you Clara?" The question hung in the air. Clara Whitmore had been a frightened girl who'd made desperate choices. Hazel was something new, something forged in the fires of loss and fear and the strange mercy of strangers. "Hazel," she said firmly. "Clara died at that stagecoach station. I'm Hazel now." Nastas nodded, respect clear in his eyes. "Then we will help you become who Hazel is meant to be. Over the following weeks, Hazel threw herself into learning everything Nadua would teach her. She learned to tan hides properly, to sew with sinew and bone needles, to identify which plants were edible and which would heal wounds. She learned phrases in Comanche, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, until Talasi laughed and corrected her pronunciation. She learned to carry Isaac on her back in the cradleboard while working, leaving her hands free, learning to trust that he was secure and comfortable. The other women gradually accepted her presence. They never treated her as one of their own, exactly, but they included her in their work, their conversations, their laughter. When she made mistakes, they corrected her without mockery. When she succeeded, they nodded approval. It was more than acceptance. It was belonging, fragile and conditional. But real, Nastas became a constant presence in her life, though he maintained careful distance. He would appear when she struggled with a heavy task, offering help without words. He would bring her things Isaac needed, a larger cradleboard as the baby grew, soft furs for the approaching winter, toys carved from wood during long evenings. They would sit together sometimes after Isaac fell asleep, the silence between them comfortable and companionable. One evening, as they sat watching the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples, Nastas spoke. "You are changing." Hazel looked down at her hands, calloused now from work, strong in ways they'd never been in Philadelphia. "I suppose I am. It is not just your hands," he said. "Your eyes are different. Less afraid, more certain." She considered this. He was right. The constant terror that had gripped her during those first weeks had faded. She still startled at sudden noises, still had nightmares about Victoria's cold smile and Constance's calculated sacrifices. But during the day, she felt grounded in a way she never had before. "I think I'm becoming who I was meant to be," she said quietly, before fear and desperation twisted me into something small. "You were never small," Nastas said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn to look at him. His eyes were soft in the fading light, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "From the moment I saw you at that station, you were fierce, like a wounded bear protecting her cub. Small things do not have that kind of strength." Her breath caught. There was meaning layered beneath his words, something she wasn't quite ready to examine. "Nastas," she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "I know," he said softly. "It is too soon. You are still healing, still discovering who you are. I do not ask for anything. I only want you to know that you are seen. You are valued." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were different from the tears she'd shed in those early, desperate days. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of something that might someday become hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They sat in silence as darkness fell. Two people who'd found each other in the midst of their respective devastations, neither quite whole but perhaps together, learning what wholeness might feel like. But peace, Hazel was learning, was always temporary. 3 days later, just as autumn began painting the hills in gold and crimson, the riders returned. This time there were more of them, perhaps a dozen, and they didn't bother with questions or pretense. They came with guns drawn and threats already forming on their lips, and this time they'd brought someone who knew exactly where to look. The woman who rode at the front of the group wore black silk despite the dust of the trail, her face hidden behind a heavy veil that stirred in the morning breeze. Hazel recognized her instantly, not from sight, but from the cold dread that seized her chest the moment the riders crested the hill. This was the woman from the stagecoach, the one who had stolen her memories and left her to die in the wilderness. The entire camp had gathered, forming a protective semicircle around the lodges. The Comanche men stood at the front, weapons within easy reach but not yet drawn. Nastas was among them, his face carved from stone, his dark eyes tracking every movement of the armed riders. Hazel stood behind him with Isaac clutched to her chest, Nadua's hand firm on her shoulder in silent support. Talasi and the other women formed a wall around her, their presence a declaration that she was one of them now, protected by more than just one man's mercy. The bearded man from before dismounted first. his rifle held casually, but his finger near the trigger. His boots hit the ground with deliberate force, raising small clouds of dust. "We've come for the woman and the child," he announced, his voice carrying across the camp with practiced authority. "We know you're hiding them. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "You have no authority here," Nastas said, his English clear and unwavering. "This is Comanche land. Your laws do not reach us. You are trespassing on territory guaranteed by treaty." "The hell they don't!" The man spat, his face reddening with anger. "That woman is a kidnapper and a thief. She stole that baby from his rightful family, and we're taking them both back to face justice. Treaty or no treaty, we've got the right to pursue criminals across any border." The veiled woman urged her horse forward then, stopping beside the bearded man. Her mount was a fine black mare, expensive and well-groomed, completely out of place among the rough horses the hired guns rode. When she spoke, her voice was refined, educated, completely at odds with the rough hired guns surrounding her. "Miss Whitmore," she called out, and the use of Hazel's real name sent ice through her veins. "Or should I say Clara? There's no use hiding anymore. I know you've regained your memories. I know you remember Philadelphia and the Hartwell house, and the night you stole Isaac from his nursery while his mother slept." Hazel's grip on Isaac tightened until the baby whimpered in protest. She forced herself to loosen her hold, to breathe slowly, to project calm she didn't feel. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her voice steady.
"Who are you?"
she called back. "Who sent you?" The woman reached up with gloved hands and slowly lifted her veil, revealing a face that was beautiful in a harsh, calculating way. Sharp cheekbones that could have been carved by a sculptor, thin lips painted a deep red, eyes like chips of blue ice that held no warmth or compassion. She was perhaps 40, with hair the color of mahogany, pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the angular planes of her face. "My name is Margaret Winters," she said. "I'm an attorney retained by Mrs. Victoria Hartwell to recover her stolen son and bring his kidnapper to justice. I've been authorized to offer you one chance, Miss Whitmore. Surrender the child peacefully, and Mrs. Hartwell will consider showing mercy in the charges brought against you." Victoria's son. Hazel laughed, the sound bitter and broken, echoing across the quiet camp. "Isaac isn't Victoria's son. She said so herself, screamed it in the parlor where she thought no one could hear. I heard her confess it, heard her admit she was going to abandon him or worse, because he was nothing but an inconvenience, a reminder of her infidelity." Margaret's expression didn't change, as though she'd been expecting this exact argument. The desperate fantasies of a woman who knew she was committing a crime, who needed to justify her actions to herself. Mrs. Hartwell has been devastated by the theft of her child. She's spent months searching for him, has offered a substantial reward for his safe return and your capture. She weeps for him every night. "She murdered her husband," Hazel shouted, past caring about dignity or composure. The words burst from her like water through a broken dam. "Thomas Hartwell didn't die in a riding accident. Victoria killed him, arranged it to look like a fall, and she told his mother so. She has letters, evidence she used to blackmail Constance into silence about what she planned to do to Isaac. She was going to send him to an orphanage in Chicago, or simply leave him somewhere to die." "Slander and lies," Margaret said dismissively, though something flickered in her eyes. The ravings of a disturbed woman who formed an unhealthy attachment to her charge. "The authorities in Philadelphia have already issued a warrant for your arrest, Miss Whitmore. Grand larceny, kidnapping, theft of property belonging to the Hartwell estate. You face 15 years in prison if convicted. You can come peacefully, or these men will take you by force. Either way, you're leaving this camp today." The hired guns shifted, hands moving toward weapons with practiced ease. The Comanche men responded immediately, arrows being knocked to bowstrings with whispers of feather against wood, knives appearing in hands with deadly efficiency. The air itself seemed to crackle with imminent violence. The tension so thick it was almost visible. "Nobody is taking her," Nastas said. and his voice carried a quiet fury that made even the armed riders hesitate. "She's under our protection. She is my wife by the laws of our people. You want her, you go through us. All of us." "Don't be foolish," Margaret said, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face for the first time. "There are a dozen armed men here. Professional soldiers, some of them, with experience in Indian conflicts. You're outnumbered, outgunned. Think about your people, about the women and children who will suffer if this turns into bloodshed." "Are we?" Nastas gestured toward the hills surrounding the camp with deliberate slowness, and Hazel's eyes followed the movement. There, barely visible among the rocks and scrub brush, were more Comanche warriors. They'd been there all along, watching, waiting, arrows trained on the intruders. At least 20 of them, possibly more, positioned with tactical precision. The hired guns had ridden into a trap without realizing it, their confidence blinding them to the reality of their situation. The bearded man cursed viciously, his swagger evaporating as he recognized their tactical disadvantage. His hand moved away from his rifle, and he glanced at Margaret with barely concealed anger. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure with visible effort. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "The law will catch up with her eventually. She can't hide here forever. Winter will come, supplies will run short, and sooner or later she'll have to leave. And when she does, we'll be waiting." "Watch me," Hazel said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. She stepped forward, moving out from behind Nastas, despite his gesture to stay back. Isaac clutched at her dress, sensing the tension, but she kept moving until she stood in clear view of Margaret and the hired guns. "I'm not going anywhere with you, and you're not taking Isaac. He's safe here, loved here, cared for in ways Victoria never cared for him. And I'll die before I let you drag him back to a woman who wants him dead." "Brave words," Margaret said, her eyes narrowing as she studied Hazel with new intensity. "But misguided. Mrs. Hartwell has no intention of harming the child. She's his mother, regardless of what poison you've been spreading. She loves him, grieved when he was taken, has spent a fortune trying to find him." "His mother?" Hazel's voice rose, carrying across the camp with unexpected power. "Then answer me this, Miss Winters. If Victoria is truly Isaac's mother, why doesn't he look anything like her or Thomas? Why does he have dark hair when both of them were fair-haired? Why does he have brown eyes when theirs were blue? Why were there whispers among the servants about Victoria's many gentlemen callers during Thomas's business trips? Why did she refuse to nurse him, refuse to hold him unless someone was watching?" The questions hung in the air like arrows finding their marks. Margaret's expression flickered just for an instant, a crack in her professional facade, and Hazel knew she'd struck a nerve. "The child's parentage is not your concern," Margaret said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Mrs. Hartwell's private affairs are not open to speculation by servants." "It's exactly my concern," Hazel pressed, taking another step forward. "Isaac isn't Thomas's son at all, is he? That's why Victoria never bonded with him, why she could talk so casually about disposing of him like unwanted furniture. He was evidence of her infidelity, proof that she'd betrayed her husband. And when Thomas discovered the truth, when he confronted her about it, she killed him, made it look like an accident. And now that Thomas is dead and she's inherited everything, Isaac is just a loose end to be tied up. A witness who could someday ask questions about who his real father was." Margaret's mask of composure cracked completely. Her horse shifted nervously beneath her, responding to her rider's sudden tension. "You know nothing about what you're speaking of," she snapped, her refined accent slipping slightly. "Mrs. Hartwell's private affairs are protected by attorney-client privilege, and I'll not stand here and listen to baseless accusations from a criminal. Are about to become very public if you don't leave this camp right now," Hazel interrupted, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "Because I wrote everything down, every word of Victoria's confession that I overheard, every detail about Thomas's death, about the blackmail, about her plans for Isaac. I documented it all and sent it to Judge Harrison Whitfield in Philadelphia before I left. with explicit instructions that if anything happened to me or Isaac, it should be opened and investigated thoroughly. It was a complete fabrication, born of desperation and the sudden clarity that sometimes comes in moments of mortal danger. But Margaret didn't know that. The attorney's face went pale beneath her powder, her eyes darting between Hazel and the hired guns as she recalculated the situation with visible panic. If Hazel had truly documented everything and sent it to a judge, if those letters existed somewhere beyond Victoria's reach, then Victoria's careful plans would unravel like cheap thread. The murder charge alone would be enough to see her hanged, and Margaret herself could be implicated as an accessory after the fact. "You're bluffing," Margaret said, but her voice wavered like a candle flame in wind. "You had no time, no resources. You were running for your life, as am I?" Hazel smiled coldly, channeling every ounce of confidence she didn't feel. "Are you willing to bet Victoria's neck on that assumption? Because I promise you, Miss Winters, if you take me back to Philadelphia, if anything happens to me or this child in transit or in custody, those letters will surface. They're in the hands of someone I trust, someone who will recognize my handwriting and Victoria's crimes. And Victoria will hang for murder while you lose your license for helping her cover it up. Is Victoria paying you enough to risk that?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. Margaret stared at Hazel with naked calculation, weighing risks and rewards, trying to determine if this desperate governess who'd lost everything was capable of such forethought. The hired guns watched their employer, waiting for direction, their confidence eroding with every second of Margaret's hesitation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret jerked her horse's reins with barely controlled fury. "We're leaving," she announced, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "But this isn't over, Miss Whitmore. Mrs. Hartwell has resources you can't imagine. She has connections in territorial government, in federal courts. She'll find another way to get what she wants. She always does." "Let her try," Hazel said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "I'll be ready. And those letters will still be waiting, ready to be opened the moment anything suspicious happens. Tell Victoria that. Tell her Clara Whitmore is dead, but Hazel remembers everything. And if she comes after us again, the whole world will know what she did." The hired guns looked confused, glancing between Margaret and the bearded man for direction. Several of them seemed relieved at the prospect of leaving without violence. The bearded man spat in the dirt, clearly furious at being outmaneuvered by a woman he'd dismissed as helpless, but he wasn't stupid enough to start a fight he couldn't win. "Mount up!" he growled to his men. "We're done here. For now." They rode out slowly, weapons still visible, trying to salvage some dignity from their retreat. Pride wounded but bodies intact, they disappeared over the hill in a cloud of dust. The Comanche warriors remained in position until the riders were completely out of sight, and even then, several men rode out to track them and ensure they truly left and weren't circling back for an ambush or planning to attack under cover of darkness. As soon as they were gone, as soon as the last echo of hoofbeats faded into silence, Hazel's legs gave out. She sank to the ground like a puppet with cut strings, still clutching Isaac, her entire body shaking with delayed shock. The baby whimpered, confused by her trembling, and she tried to soothe him but couldn't stop her own shaking. Nastas was beside her instantly, dropping to his knees and pulling them both into his arms. His hands were gentle on her shoulders, his voice soft near her ear. "You did well," he said. "Very well. You were magnificent." "I lied," she gasped out, the words tumbling over each other. "I didn't send any letters. I didn't document anything. I had no time, no way to reach anyone. If she calls my bluff, if she comes back with proof that no such letters exist, then we will deal with it," Nastas said firmly, his arms tightening around her. "But I do not think she will. You planted doubt, and doubt is a powerful weapon against those who have much to lose. Victoria will not risk exposure based on what might be a lie. She will retreat, reconsider, and perhaps decide that one bastard child is not worth the gallows. Nadua approached and knelt beside them, her weathered hand cupping Hazel's cheek with surprising tenderness. The old woman's eyes were fierce with pride. "You have the heart of a warrior," she said. "You faced your fear and did not break. You protected your cub like a she-wolf. Your son will grow strong with such a mother. Your son." The words settled over Hazel like a benediction. Isaac wasn't hers by blood, would never be hers in the eyes of the white man's law. But in every way that mattered, in every choice she'd made and sacrifice she'd endured, in every moment of fear faced and danger overcome, he was hers, and she was his. The days that followed were strange, suspended between relief and lingering fear. Hazel waited for Margaret and the hired guns to return with different tactics, for Victoria to send more men or different threats. She jumped at every distant sound, saw threats in every stranger who passed near their territory. But weeks passed, then months, and no one came. Scouts reported that Margaret's group had traveled straight to the nearest town and boarded a train heading east without looking back. The first snow fell in late November, blanketing the camp in white silence, and still they remained undisturbed. Nastas explained that scouts had tracked Margaret's group all the way to the train station, had watched them board and depart. "They are gone," he assured her, holding her close on a night when nightmares had stolen her sleep. "And they are not coming back. Your words put fear in them, and fear is a fire that consumes from within. Victoria will not risk exposure, not when she has already gotten away with murder once. She will find another way to ease her conscience, perhaps tell herself that Isaac died in the wilderness. But she will not come here." As winter deepened and the world turned white and silent, Hazel found herself settling into a life she'd never imagined. She'd left Philadelphia as Clara Whitmore, a frightened governess running from forces beyond her control, armed with nothing but desperate courage. She'd woken at Bitter Springs as no one, a woman without identity or memory or hope, abandoned and left to die. But here, in this Comanche camp, surrounded by people who owed her nothing but gave her everything, she'd become Hazel, just Hazel, mother to Isaac, student of Nadua, friend to Talasi and the other women who'd accepted her despite every reason not to, sister to warriors who would have fought and died to protect her, and something more to Nastas, though neither of them had yet named it with words. It was on a clear winter morning, with ice crystals turning the world into diamond dust and the sky so blue it hurt to look at, that he finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. They were alone at the stream, breaking ice to reach water, working in comfortable silence. Isaac was bundled warmly on Hazel's back and cooing at the bright sky, fascinated by the way sunlight reflected off the snow. "I want to marry you," Nastas said abruptly, without preamble or poetry. His hands stilled on the ice, and he looked at her with eyes that held both hope and fear. "In our way before the tribe, I want to make you my wife and Isaac my son, not just in protection, but in truth. Not because you need shelter, though I will always provide it. Not because you need a defender, though I will always stand between you and harm. But because when I see you, I see home. And I have not felt that since Kimimela died." Hazel's hands stilled on the water vessel, cold, forgotten. She turned to face him fully, seeing the vulnerability in his dark eyes, the fear of rejection that he was brave enough to risk. This man who had saved her life without knowing her, who had given her space to heal and time to remember, who had asked for nothing and offered everything. "I'm still afraid," she admitted, her breath misting in the cold air. "Afraid that Victoria will come back with a better plan. Afraid that I'm not good enough for this life, this tribe, these people who have given me so much. Afraid that I'll fail Isaac, fail you, fail everyone who's believed in me. Then we will be afraid together," Nastas said simply, reaching out to take her free hand in his. "Fear shared is fear halved. And love, true love, does not require perfection. It only requires presence. It requires showing up every day and choosing each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She looked at this man who had saved her when he had every reason to ride past, who had given her shelter and patience and the space to become who she needed to be, who had defended her against armed men without hesitation, who had asked for nothing and offered everything, including his heart. And she realized that somewhere between terror and gratitude, between desperation and hope, between the moment he'd first offered her water and the moment he'd stood between her and her pursuers, she'd fallen in love with him. Yes, she said, the word barely a whisper at first, then louder, more certain, filled with all the hope she'd thought she'd lost forever. Yes, I want that too. I want to build a life with you. I want Isaac to call you father. I want to wake up beside you and know that I'm home. I want to stop running and start living. The smile that broke across Nastas's face was like sunrise after endless night, like spring after the hardest winter. He closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent, as though she were something precious and fragile. Then we will marry when the spring comes and the world is green again. We will have a ceremony and you will become one of us. Not white, not Comanche, but something new, something that belongs to itself and no one else. He kissed her then, gentle and questioning at first, then deeper as she kissed him back with all the hope and fear and desperate love she'd been holding inside. Behind them, Isaac laughed, a sound of pure joy, as though he understood that his fractured family was finally becoming whole. Spring came with wildflowers carpeting the hills and warm winds that smelled of new grass and possibility. True to his word, Nastas married Hazel in the traditional way with the entire tribe as witnesses. She wore a dress of white deerskin that Nadua and the other women had spent weeks preparing, decorating it with intricate beadwork that told the story of her journey in symbols and patterns. From lost to found, from broken to whole, from Clara to Hazel, from alone to beloved, they built their own lodge together, working side by side to raise the poles and stretch the hides, creating a space that was theirs alone. Isaac took his first steps inside it, stumbling from Hazel to Nastas with squeals of delight, and both adults wept with joy. He began calling Nastas Papa within weeks, and would cry if separated from him for long. The transformation was complete. They were a family, forged not by blood but by choice. News occasionally reached them from the outside world through traders and travelers who passed through their territory. Philadelphia seemed impossibly distant, a place from a story Hazel had once heard, rather than a life she'd actually lived. She heard nothing of Victoria or Margaret Winters or the Hartwell family, and she told herself that silence was victory. Perhaps Victoria had remarried, found a new, wealthy husband to bankroll her lifestyle. Perhaps she'd simply decided Isaac wasn't worth the risk. Or perhaps the threat Hazel had manufactured, the phantom letters that existed only in Margaret's fears, had been enough to keep her away. Years passed like water flowing in a stream, each season bringing changes, but the current remaining constant. Isaac grew from baby to boy to young man, strong and wild and loved by everyone in the tribe. He learned to ride before he could read, to track animals before he could write his name in English. He belonged to two worlds and was comfortable in both, switching between English and Comanche with the ease of a child who'd never been taught. That difference meant division. He became a skilled hunter, a loyal friend, a young man of integrity who made both his parents proud. Hazel bore Nastas two more children, a daughter they named Ayana, whose laugh could light up the darkest day, and a son they called Takoda, who had his father's quiet strength and his mother's fierce determination. The lodge grew crowded and loud and full of the chaos and joy that only children can bring. Nadua, grown more frail but no less fierce, doted on all three children equally, telling them stories of the old ways and teaching them the wisdom she'd accumulated over long decades of survival and loss and unexpected grace. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low to glowing embers, Nastas would sometimes ask Hazel if she ever regretted her choice. If she ever missed the life she'd left behind, the world of grand houses and proper society and servants who called her Miss instead of sister. If she ever wondered what might have happened if she'd made different choices, taken different paths. And every time she would shake her head and take his hand and tell him the truth. That Clara Whitmore had died at that stagecoach station, and good riddance to her and everything she represented. That Hazel had been born in the dust and desperation of Bitter Springs, saved by a Comanche rider who'd seen worth in someone the world had thrown away. That she'd traded everything she'd been for everything she'd become, and it was the best bargain she'd ever made. That she'd lost a name but found herself. That she'd lost her memory but gained a life worth remembering. On the 10th anniversary of the day Nastas had found her, Hazel stood on the same ridge where he'd once brought her to see Kimimela's grave. There were 4 markers there now, weathered by wind and time, but still standing strong. Kimimela's original stone, acknowledging the wife who'd come before. The marker Nastas had made for Hazel all those years ago, when he'd first decided to claim her as his own. And 2 smaller stones, added later with her own hands, that simply read family and home. Isaac stood beside her, nearly grown now at 15, tall and strong and good in ways that made her heart swell with pride. He'd become a skilled hunter and tracker, respected by the tribe despite his mixed heritage and complicated origins. He knew the truth of his beginnings, knew about Clara and Victoria and the desperate flight that had brought him here. Hazel had told him everything when he'd turned 13, believing he deserved to know his own story, all of it, without editing or softening. "Do you ever wonder about them?" he asked now, his voice deeper than she still expected, reminding her that her baby was becoming a man. "The Hartwells, my blood family, the people I came from?" "Sometimes," Hazel admitted, because she'd never lied to him and wouldn't start now. "But not often. And not with longing, more like curiosity about characters in a story I once heard." "Good," Isaac said firmly, his jaw set in a way that reminded her of Nastas. "Because you're my real mother. The one who chose me when she didn't have to. The one who risked everything to save me. The one who stayed when staying was hard. Blood doesn't make family. Choice does, love does. You taught me that." Tears pricked Hazel's eyes, but they were happy tears now, the kind that come from joy too big to contain. She pulled her son close, this boy she'd saved, and who had, in turn, saved her from a life of fear and running and never belonging. "I'll always stay," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "That's what family does. That's what love means." Below them, the camp spread out in the valley like a living tapestry, smoke rising from cooking fires. Children playing games that hadn't changed in generations, dogs barking, horses grazing, the sounds of life continuing as it always had and always would. Nastas appeared from their lodge, Ayana on his shoulders squealing with delight, and Takoda running ahead with a stick he was pretending was a lance. He looked up at the ridge and waved, his smile visible even from this distance. And her heart swelled with love so intense it was almost painful. Hazel waved back, her heart full in ways she'd never imagined possible back in that other life, that other world that seemed like it belonged to someone else entirely. She'd been abandoned at a stagecoach stop with an infant and no memory, left to die in the wilderness by people who'd seen her as disposable, as a problem to be eliminated. She'd lost everything she'd been and woken to nothing. But a Comanche rider had seen her differently, had seen possibility where others saw only problems, had seen worth where others saw only worthlessness, had offered his hand and said 2 words that changed everything, 2 words that gave her not just survival, but life. "You are found." And she had been. Not just found, but forged in fire and fear and the stubborn mercy of strangers. Not just saved, but transformed. From nameless to named, from lost to home, from broken to beautifully, impossibly, miraculously whole, she took Isaac's hand, and together they walked down the ridge toward the family waiting below, toward the life they'd built from ashes and mercy, and the stubborn refusal to let cruelty have the final word, toward the love that had grown in the spaces where fear used to live. toward the home that existed not in a place, but in the hearts of people who'd chosen each other, toward everything that mattered. 2 years had passed since that autumn day when armed men rode into camp, demanding the return of a stolen child. 2 years since Hazel had faced down Margaret Winters with nothing but desperate courage and a convincing lie. The world had changed in those years, and so had the people who inhabited it. Hazel stood at the edge of the camp, now preparing for the seasonal move to follow the buffalo herds westward. She was 24 now, her hands calloused from work, her face touched by sun and wind in ways that would have horrified the governess she'd once been. But her eyes were bright, holding a contentment she'd never known in her previous life. Isaac was 3 years old, running through the camp with the other children, his laughter piercing the morning air. He spoke more Comanche than English now, called Nastas Papa without hesitation, and had no memory of Philadelphia or grand houses or the life he'd been born into. To him, this was the only world that had ever existed. Nastas emerged from their lodge, carrying supplies for the day's work. He moved with the same quiet confidence he'd always possessed, but there was a lightness to him now that hadn't been there when they first met. The grief that had shadowed him for so long had eased, replaced by something gentler. He caught her eye and smiled, a small private expression meant only for her. "You are thinking too hard again," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I can see it in your face." Hazel turned to him with a smile, just remembering. 2 years since they came, 2 years of peace. "And you still watch the horizon every day," Nastas observed, his tone gentle rather than critical. "Still waiting for them to return." She couldn't deny it. Despite the passage of time, despite the silence from the east, she remained vigilant. "Old habits," she said quietly. "Fear doesn't release its hold easily." "No," he agreed, "but neither does love. And we have built something strong here, something worth protecting." They stood together watching Isaac play, and Hazel marveled at how far they'd all come. The boy who'd been stolen to save his life was now thriving, loved by an entire community. The woman who'd lost her identity had found a new one, more authentic than anything she'd known before. And the man who'd been drowning in grief had learned to live again. A commotion near the camp's edge drew their attention. Riders approached, but these were expected. Traders who came through regularly with goods and news from the outside world. One of them, a weathered man named Chester, who'd been making this route for years, dismounted and approached with a folded newspaper in his hand. "Ma'am," he greeted Hazel with a respectful nod. "Got something you might want to see. News from Philadelphia." He held out the paper, his expression carefully neutral. Hazel's heart clenched, but she took the newspaper with steady hands. The article Chester pointed to was dated 3 months earlier. Victoria Hartwell had died in what authorities were calling suspicious circumstances, a fall down the stairs in her mansion that had broken her neck. The investigation had uncovered irregularities in her late husband's death, and her attorney Margaret Winters had been arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. The words blurred as Hazel read them again, trying to process what they meant. Victoria was dead. Margaret was facing justice. The threat that had hung over them for 2 years had simply evaporated like morning mist. "There's more," Chester said, pulling out a second paper. "Says they're looking for the Hartwell heir, the boy who disappeared. Want to restore his inheritance now that the truth about Victoria's crimes is coming out. There's a substantial reward for information." Isaac had wandered over during the conversation, curious about the adults gathered in serious discussion. He tugged on Hazel's skirt. "Mama, what wrong?" She looked down at her son, this beautiful boy who spoke in broken sentences, mixing 2 languages, who knew nothing of mansions or inheritance or the complicated world he'd been born into. She thought about the life he could have if she came forward. Wealth, education, opportunities she could never provide. Everything the white world valued, but she also thought about what he would lose. His language, his identity, his family, the freedom to run wild through camps and learn from elders and belong to a community that valued him for who he was, not what he represented. She thought about Nastas, who'd become his father in every way that mattered, about the cousins and friends who played with him daily, about the world he understood and loved. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," she said, switching to Comanche as she lifted him into her arms. "Everything is fine." Chester watched this exchange with knowing eyes. "So I'm guessing you don't want me passing along any information about the boy's whereabouts?" "Basil..." "What boy?" Hazel asked, meeting his gaze steadily. "I don't know anything about any missing Hartwell heir. My son's name is Isaac. He was born here among the people. That's all I know." Chester nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his weathered face.
"Fair enough."
"Just thought you folks deserved to know the threat's past. That woman can't hurt you anymore." He tipped his hat and returned to his trading, leaving the newspaper behind. That evening, after Isaac had been put to bed, Hazel and Nastas sat outside their lodge, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. She held the newspaper in her lap, its presence a weight despite its physical lightness. "I could have claimed the inheritance," she said quietly, "for Isaac's future. Given him opportunities where you gave him the greatest opportunity," Nastas interrupted gently. "The opportunity to know who he is, to belong somewhere, to be loved unconditionally. What is money compared to that? But what if he grows up and resents me for the choice I made?" The fear had been gnawing at her all day. What if he wishes I'd taken him back, given him that life? Nastas was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Then we will deal with that when the time comes. But I do not think he will resent you. You saved his life twice, once from Victoria's cruelty, and once from a world that would have taught him to be ashamed of who he is. That is not something to regret." Hazel leaned against her husband, drawing strength from his solid presence. "It's really over, isn't it? After all this time, we're finally safe." "We were always safe," Nastas said. "From the moment you chose to stay, you were safe. Everything else was just learning to believe it." Over the following weeks, Hazel found herself gradually releasing the vigilance she'd maintained for so long. She stopped scanning every horizon for riders, stopped jumping at unexpected sounds, stopped waking in the night with her heart racing, certain that armed men were coming to take Isaac away. The fear that had been her constant companion slowly loosened its grip. She threw herself into life with renewed energy. She learned more complex beadwork from Nadwa, creating beautiful patterns that told stories without words. She helped the other women prepare hides for the coming winter. She taught Isaac his letters and numbers in quiet moments, wanting him to have access to both worlds, even if he never chose to live in the white one. Nastas watched these changes with quiet approval. One evening, as they prepared for sleep, he said, "You are different now. The fear is leaving you." "I'm trying," Hazel admitted. "It's hard to let go of something I've carried for so long, but I want to be present for this life, not constantly worried about losing it." "You are doing well," he assured her, "and Isaac benefits from seeing his mother at peace. Children learn what they see, and he is learning that home is a place where fear does not rule." Spring arrived with its usual burst of color and renewal. The camp celebrated the season with traditional ceremonies, and Hazel participated fully, no longer the outsider she'd once been. She'd earned her place through years of work and dedication, through raising her son to honor both his heritages, through her unwavering commitment to the community that had saved her. On the anniversary of the day Nastas had found her at Bitter Springs, they returned to that place together. It looked different now, more weathered, more forgotten. The Stagecoach station had been abandoned, its wood graying and warping in the elements. But standing there, Hazel could remember every detail of that desperate day. The heat, the fear, the certainty that she and Isaac would die alone. "I was no one here," she said softly, Isaac playing nearby under Nastas's watchful eye. "I had no name, no memory, no hope. Just terror and a baby I couldn't even remember taking. And now," Nastas prompted, "now I'm Hazel," she said with quiet certainty. "Wife of Nastas, mother of Isaac, member of the people. I know exactly who I am, and I chose every piece of it." They stood together in that place of endings and beginnings, watching their son play in the dust where she'd once waited to die. The circle felt complete somehow. She'd been abandoned here, but she'd also been found here. Had lost everything, but gained more than she'd ever imagined possible. "Thank you," she said, taking Nastas's hand, "for seeing me that day, for stopping when you could have ridden past, for giving me a chance to become who I was meant to be." "You gave yourself that chance," Nastas replied. "I only offered my hand. You were the one brave enough to take it." As they rode back to camp with Isaac, chattering happily between them, Hazel realized that the story people would tell about her life wouldn't be about what she'd lost or where she'd come from. It would be about what she'd found and who she'd become. About a woman who'd been abandoned with nothing and had built everything. She was no longer Clara Whitmore, the frightened governess running from forces beyond her control. She was Hazel, who had chosen her own name and her own life, who had faced down armed men with nothing but words and courage, who had made a home in a world that should have been foreign, but instead felt more real than anything she'd known before. And that evening, as she tucked Isaac into bed in their lodge, as Nastas prepared the fire for the night, as the sounds of the camp settled into peaceful darkness around them, she felt something she'd never quite experienced in all her years in Philadelphia's grand houses. She felt completely, entirely, perfectly at home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.